The sun beat down on the tropical waters of Leyte Gulf, creating a shimmering haze that obscured the horizon. But for the men in the landing craft, the heat was the least of their concerns. It was October 20th, 1944, a date that had been circled on calendars and etched into the mind of one man for 2.5 agonizing years. General Douglas MacArthur was returning to the Philippines. The scene was chaotic, a cacophony of roaring engines, shouting naval officers, and the distant, terrifying crack of Japanese sniper fire from the tree line. Yet, amidst this swirling vortex of war, the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific was not focused on cover, nor on the precise coordinates of the enemy. He was focused on the angle of the sun, the crease in his khakis, and the positioning of the dozen photographers he had handpicked to document this moment. MacArthur was wading through knee-deep water, the tepid surf swirling around his legs, dragging against his stride. To the casual observer, this was a heroic general leading his men onto the beachhead. To the terrified naval commanders, watching through binoculars from the safety of the cruisers offshore, it was a nightmare. The beach wasn't secure, not even close. Japanese mortar teams were still active in the dense foliage just a few hundred yards inland. American infantrymen were currently engaged in fierce firefights to clear defensive positions. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, wet sand, and fear. Yet, MacArthur had decided to wade ashore hours before the area was deemed safe. Why? Because the light was fading, and he needed the perfect shot for the morning editions in New York and Washington. This wasn't a military operation in the traditional sense. This was high theater, a production orchestrated by a man who understood the power of image better than any general in American history. MacArthur didn't care about the tactical situation at that precise moment. He cared about the narrative. He had promised I shall return when he fled the Philippines in the dark days of 1942, leaving his men behind to face the horror of the Bataan Death March. Now, he was delivering on that promise in the most dramatic, cinematic way possible. He was willing to risk his life, the lives of his senior staff, and the stability of the entire Pacific Command for a photo opportunity. The cameras clicked furiously, capturing every splash, every stern expression. The photographers knew their assignment: capture the liberator. They framed the shot low, making MacArthur look like a titan rising from the sea. The resulting image, MacArthur, jaw set, sunglasses on, striding purposefully through the surf, would become one of the most iconic photographs of the 20th century. It would be splashed across the front page of every major newspaper in America within 48 hours, reigniting the public's adoration for their American Caesar. But thousands of miles away, in the Oval Office of the White House, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was about to receive the report of what his Pacific commander had done. He would read about the unauthorized landing, the risk to the command structure, and the sheer recklessness of the stunt, and he was going to be furious. But the question plaguing Roosevelt wasn't about MacArthur's competence. It was whether the President of the United States had the political capital to do anything about it. When the detailed reports of MacArthur's Leyte landing finally reached the War Department in Washington, they confirmed a disturbing pattern that had been metastasizing for 2 years. MacArthur had staged a publicity stunt in an active, hot combat zone. Naval commanders hadn't been fully informed of his movements, causing a panic in the fleet. Air support squadrons had to be scrambled at the last second, diverting precious fuel and attention from combat patrols to protect the general's photo op. Ground forces, already under fire, had to redeploy to provide a security perimeter for a speech, exposing their flanks to the enemy. In any other army, under any other commander, such a stunt would have resulted in an immediate court-martial, or at the very least, a career-ending formal reprimand. It was a dereliction of duty to prioritize personal glory over the safety of the mission. But Roosevelt had learned a hard, bitter lesson about Douglas MacArthur since the war began in 1942. The general was untouchable. He had cultivated a cult of personality so strong, so pervasive among the American voting public, that he operated outside the normal chain of command. Roosevelt, a master politician, had made a calculation that he would be forced to repeat throughout the war. He needed MacArthur the symbol more than he needed to discipline MacArthur the soldier. To understand this paralysis in Washington, one must look back to March 1942. The world was falling apart. The Japanese war machine was sweeping across the Pacific, unstoppable and terrifying. Douglas MacArthur was ordered to escape from the island fortress of Corregidor just before Japanese forces overran the Philippines. President Roosevelt had ordered him out, not out of personal affection, but because the United States could not afford the devastating propaganda blow of having its most famous general paraded through Tokyo in chains. MacArthur made a harrowing escape by PT boat and B-17 bomber, eventually arriving in Australia. Upon his arrival, looking haggard but defiant, he delivered the statement that would define his public image for the rest of the war. "I came through, and I shall return." It was a masterstroke of rhetoric. It was short, dramatic, and intensely personal. He didn't say, "We shall return." He said, "I." The press loved it. The American public, desperate for heroes, after months of humiliating defeats at Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and Singapore, loved it even more. MacArthur instantly became the face of America's war in the Pacific, a living symbol of defiance. However, there was a massive, toxic gap between this polished public image and the grim reality on the ground. While newspapers in Chicago and New York portrayed MacArthur as a fearless warrior leading from the front, the troops actually fighting in the Pacific had a very different, very bitter nickname for him. They called him Dugout Doug. The nickname was born from the perception, fair or not, that MacArthur stayed safely deep in the tunnels of Corregidor while his men were being slaughtered above ground. This contrast between what America believed about MacArthur and what his own soldiers knew would persist and fester throughout the war. For the men left behind on Bataan, the headline "Hero of the Pacific" felt like a knife in the back. Imagine the scene. You are a soldier on the Bataan Peninsula. You are starving, your ribs showing through your skin. You are eating mule meat and monkey meat just to survive. You are riddled with malaria, dysentery, and jungle rot. You are running out of ammunition, fighting a desperate, losing battle against a well-supplied enemy. And then, huddled around a crackling shortwave radio, you hear that your commander, the man who promised to stand with you to the end, has escaped to a palace in Australia. The nickname Dugout Doug wasn't a joke to these men. It was a curse. It was the sound of men who felt utterly abandoned by the one man who was sworn to protect them. This bitterness created a duality in the American war effort. The MacArthur worshipped by the civilians, and the MacArthur resented by the professionals. By July 1942, the strategic situation had stabilized enough for the U.S. to plan an offensive. Roosevelt met with the Joint Chiefs of Staff to decide on the path to Tokyo. Two routes were possible. The debate that ensued would tear the military leadership apart. The first option was the Central Pacific route, championed by Admiral Chester Nimitz. This path would slice through the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, and eventually to Formosa, Taiwan. It was direct, it relied on the growing power of the U.S. Navy's aircraft carriers, and it bypassed well-defended Japanese strongholds, leaving them to wither on the vine. The second option was the Southwest Pacific route, championed by General MacArthur. This path would go through the fever swamp jungles of New Guinea and up through the Philippines. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military body in the nation, recommended the Central Pacific route as the main offensive. Their reasoning was cold, hard logic. It was shorter. It played to America's massive naval advantages. It would allow carrier-based air power to dominate the skies without relying on muddy jungle airfields. The Southwest Pacific route would be longer, more difficult, sloggier, and significantly more costly in American lives. General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, and arguably the most respected soldier in the world, supported the Central Pacific strategy. Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, pushed for it with aggressive intensity. Admiral King's feelings about MacArthur went far beyond professional disagreement. He despised the man personally. King, a brilliant but abrasive naval officer who allegedly shaved with a blowtorch, saw MacArthur as a preening, self-promoting egomaniac who put his own glory ahead of military effectiveness. King had no problem telling Roosevelt exactly what he thought should be done about the MacArthur problem. "Fire him," King told Roosevelt bluntly in one heated meeting. "He's insubordinate, he's impossible to manage, and he's wasting resources on a strategy that serves his ego more than it serves the war effort." King didn't care that MacArthur was popular with the public. King cared about tonnage, logistics, and victory. He argued that MacArthur's constant, screaming demands for more resources, more ships, more planes, more men were interfering with the vital Central Pacific offensive. Every supply ship sent to Australia was one less ship supporting the Navy's drive across the Central Pacific. General Marshall took a different, more nuanced approach. Marshall was diplomatic, patient, and consummately professional. He tried to manage MacArthur through careful communication, stroking his ego when necessary, and occasionally accommodating his demands to keep the peace. Marshall played the good cop to King's bad cop, but privately, Marshall was just as frustrated. He told his staff that MacArthur was impossible, but he's ours, meaning the army had to deal with him, whether they liked it or not, because firing him would cause a collapse in home front morale. Throughout 1943 and into 1944, MacArthur's headquarters in Australia transformed into a political machine. It became a source for carefully crafted leaks to American journalists. These weren't accidental security breaches. These were deliberate acts of psychological warfare directed not at the Japanese, but at the White House. The pattern was always the same, and it was devastatingly effective. MacArthur's staff, often led by his loyal press officers, would provide background information to friendly reporters from conservative newspapers. The reporters would then write articles suggesting that liberating the Philippines was both militarily necessary and, more importantly, a moral imperative. The narrative was simple. MacArthur had promised, "I shall return." How could America break that promise? How could a Christian nation abandon the Christian Filipinos to the Japanese occupation? The American public, reading these stories over their morning coffee, had no idea they were being manipulated. They read these articles and believed they were getting objective military analysis. They didn't know that the information was coming directly from MacArthur's headquarters with the specific goal of making it politically impossible for Roosevelt to bypass the Philippines. It was propaganda disguised as journalism. By mid-1944, the public expectation that America would liberate the Philippines had become overwhelming. Newspapers regularly featured heart-wrenching stories about American prisoners of war still held in Philippine camps like Cabanatuan. They published accounts from Filipino resistance fighters asking when America would fulfill its promise. All of this coverage made one thing clear to the politicians in Washington. If Roosevelt decided to follow the Joint Chiefs' advice and bypass the Philippines to go straight for Formosa, he would face a massive public backlash. He would be accused of betraying the troops and breaking the nation's word. This wasn't military strategy. This was blackmail. MacArthur was using press manipulation and public sentiment to force the president's hand. Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs could see exactly what MacArthur was doing, but they were trapped. Stopping him would require a public confrontation that would damage the war effort. In the summer of 1944, the tension came to a head. Roosevelt traveled to Hawaii to meet with MacArthur and Nimitz to make the final decision. The Joint Chiefs still preferred Formosa. It was closer to Japan. Taking Formosa would cut the supply lines to the Japanese forces in the Philippines, effectively neutralizing them without the need for a bloody invasion. It would save thousands of American lives and likely end the war months sooner. General Marshall agreed with King's assessment. From a purely military standpoint, bypassing the Philippines was the logical choice, but Marshall also understood the crushing political reality Roosevelt was facing. MacArthur had successfully made liberating the Philippines a matter of American honor. If Roosevelt ordered the bypass, the Republicans would use it against him in the upcoming 1944 election. They would paint him as the man who abandoned American heroes. Roosevelt, looking at the maps and looking at the polls, made his decision. The Philippines would be invaded. MacArthur would get his triumphant return. The Joint Chiefs' preferred strategy would be set aside. Political pressure had overcome military judgment. Admiral King was furious. He believed Roosevelt had made a mistake that would cost American lives for no strategic gain. Marshall accepted the decision professionally, but privately shared King's frustration. MacArthur had won, not through superior strategic arguments, but through public manipulation. He had forced the President of the United States to abandon a strategy recommended by his top military advisors. The invasion of the Philippines went forward, leading to the spectacle at Leyte. When MacArthur waded ashore on October 20th, 1944, the staging created serious tactical headaches. Naval commanders offshore hadn't been informed that MacArthur planned to wade ashore at that particular moment. They had to scramble to provide air cover and naval gun support in case Japanese forces counterattacked. Air Force commanders had to redirect fighter patrols to protect a general who had decided to make himself a target. Ground forces that had been focusing on clearing inland positions had to redeploy to secure a beachhead that MacArthur was using as a photo backdrop. Once on shore, shaking the water from his uniform, MacArthur walked to a microphone that had been set up for the occasion. His voice trembled with emotion as he broadcast to the islands. "People of the Philippines, I have returned." It was perfect theater. It was exactly what MacArthur wanted. The story dominated American newspapers for days. MacArthur was portrayed as the conquering hero keeping his promise. The military risks he had taken and the resources he had diverted for this spectacle were never mentioned in the press. Back in Washington, Roosevelt read the accounts and saw the photographs. He knew immediately what MacArthur had done. He knew he had been outmaneuvered again, and he knew there was nothing he could do about it. Meanwhile, General George Marshall sat in his Pentagon office, the weight of the world on his shoulders. As Army Chief of Staff, Marshall was technically MacArthur's superior, but managing Douglas MacArthur had become the most exhausting part of his job. Marshall was a man of immense discipline, a stoic who believed in order and respect for authority. MacArthur believed in none of those things when they interfered with his destiny. Marshall had to provide MacArthur with troops, supplies, and equipment, balancing those needs against the massive requirements of the war in Europe against Hitler. He had to coordinate MacArthur's operations with the rest of the Pacific strategy. It was an impossible situation. Marshall was the architect of the Allied victory, organizing armies across the globe. He didn't have time for tantrums, yet he had to spend hours every week massaging MacArthur's wounded pride just to keep the Southwest Pacific Theater moving. Marshall took the high road every single day, not because it was easy, but because he knew the country couldn't afford a public feud between its top generals. "He's impossible," Marshall told one aide, rubbing his temples. "But he's ours." Marshall meant that the army had to deal with him. He couldn't just wash his hands of MacArthur. But Marshall also understood something terrifying. Roosevelt's refusal to discipline MacArthur was creating a precedent that could undermine military authority for generations. If generals learned they could ignore orders and face no consequences as long as they were popular, then civilian control of the military, a cornerstone of American democracy, would become meaningless. Admiral King watched the Leyte photos with a simmering rage. King had spent 2 years arguing that MacArthur's route was inefficient. He had presented charts, graphs, and detailed analyses showing that the Central Pacific route was superior. He had been overruled because of politics. King was fighting 2 wars, one against the Imperial Japanese Navy and one against Douglas MacArthur's ego. Every division sent to MacArthur was a division that Nimitz couldn't use. Every transport ship diverted to the Philippines was a ship that couldn't support the Navy's advance toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa. King calculated these costs in blood. He believed MacArthur's strategy was prolonging the war. But King's frustration went deeper than strategy. He was a believer in discipline. MacArthur's behavior violated everything King stood for. Officers didn't get to publicly criticize their superiors. They didn't get to leak classified information. They didn't get to manipulate public opinion. Yet MacArthur did all of these things and prospered. King told his staff that MacArthur was the most dangerous man in the Pacific Theater. He meant dangerous to American democracy. King believed that Roosevelt's tolerance of MacArthur's insubordination was corrupting the system. MacArthur should have been fired in 1942, King would later write. The resentment wasn't limited to Washington. In Europe, General Dwight Eisenhower watched MacArthur's antics with a mix of recognition and insult. Eisenhower had worked for MacArthur in the Philippines before the war. He knew the man's vanity intimately. Eisenhower was currently dealing with his own difficult subordinate, the British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery was egotistical and difficult, but there was a difference. Eisenhower could threaten to fire Montgomery. MacArthur faced no such constraints. MacArthur knew Roosevelt wouldn't touch him. Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley, the generals fighting in the mud of Europe, followed orders. When Patton slapped a soldier in Sicily, he was nearly fired and sidelined for months. He had to apologize publicly. Yet MacArthur could stage dangerous photo ops and defy strategy without a slap on the wrist. This double standard was corrosive. It made the generals in Europe question the fairness of the system. If MacArthur could advance his career through PR campaigns, why should anyone else accept professional constraints? It was a poison in the bloodstream of the officer corps. When the war ended, the problem didn't go away. It evolved. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. President Harry Truman, who had inherited the presidency after Roosevelt's death in April, appointed MacArthur as Supreme Commander of Allied Powers, SCAP, to oversee the occupation of Japan. It was the logical choice given MacArthur's experience, but it was also dangerous. MacArthur immediately began treating the occupation as his personal fiefdom. He ruled Japan with near absolute autonomy. He issued directives restructuring the Japanese government, land ownership, and economy without clearing them with Washington. MacArthur made policy decisions about Japanese war criminals without consulting the State Department. He essentially governed Japan as a proconsul, an American emperor in all but name. Roosevelt was dead. Truman was new to the job and overwhelmed with the dawn of the atomic age and the rebuilding of Europe. MacArthur took advantage of this transition to establish himself as an independent power. He had spent 3 years learning that he could ignore presidential authority without consequences. Now, he was applying those lessons to the governance of a nation. He didn't ask permission. He informed Washington of what he had already done. Truman watched this with growing alarm. Truman was a different man than Roosevelt. He was a plain-spoken Missourian, a former artillery captain in World War I, who understood the chain of command down to his bones. He hadn't been involved in the high-level strategy of World War II, but he had a keen sense of right and wrong. He saw immediately that Roosevelt had created a monster. Roosevelt let MacArthur run wild because he was afraid of the political cost, Truman told his aides. Roosevelt was wrong. Generals have to follow orders, whether they're popular or not. But Truman was pragmatic. He couldn't fire MacArthur immediately. The occupation needed stability, so Truman waited. He watched MacArthur rule Japan. He watched MacArthur give interviews hinting at a presidential run in 1948, and Truman began keeping a file. He documented every instance of insubordination. Every slight, every moment, MacArthur acted as if he were above the president. Truman vowed that if MacArthur ever crossed the line into open defiance, he would not hesitate. He was not Roosevelt. The test came in 1950. On June 25th, North Korean forces poured across the 38th parallel, invading South Korea. Truman committed American forces to the United Nations defense effort. He needed a commander. Despite his reservations, he appointed MacArthur. MacArthur was in Japan. He had the logistics in place, and he was a legend. It seemed like the only choice. But the warning signs flared up almost immediately. In July 1950, just weeks after taking command, MacArthur flew to Formosa to meet with Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Chinese nationalists. He did this without authorization from Truman. His visit was interpreted by the world as an American commitment to defend Taiwan against Communist China, which directly contradicted Truman's policy of neutralizing the Taiwan Strait to prevent a wider war. When Truman demanded an explanation, MacArthur waved it off as a courtesy call. Truman didn't buy it. Then, in August, MacArthur sent a message to the Veterans of Foreign Wars, VFW convention. In it, he blasted Truman's Asia policy and argued for a more aggressive stance, implicitly suggesting war with China. Truman was incandescent with rage. He ordered MacArthur to withdraw the message. MacArthur did, but he made sure it had already been leaked to the press. It was a calculated act of insubordination, a replay of his tactics against Roosevelt. He was testing Truman, seeing if the new president would fold like the old one. Truman told his advisors, "I won't make Roosevelt's mistake." The war in Korea shifted wildly. MacArthur pulled off a brilliant tactical gamble with the Incheon landings in September 1950, cutting North Korean supply lines and reversing the war. It was a stroke of genius that reaffirmed his belief in his own infallibility. But that hubris led to disaster. Ignoring intelligence reports and Truman's warnings, MacArthur pushed north toward the Yalu River, the border with China. He assured Truman at a meeting on Wake Island that the Chinese would not intervene. He was wrong. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops poured across the border, smashing the UN forces and sending them retreating in bitter cold. MacArthur panicked. He demanded authority to bomb China, to use nuclear weapons, to expand the war. Truman refused. Truman wanted a limited war to contain communism, not World War III. MacArthur couldn't accept this. He began to publicly sabotage the president's efforts to negotiate a ceasefire. He wanted total victory, and he was willing to wreck the presidency to get it. The end came on April 5th, 1951. House Republican leader Joseph Martin stood on the floor of Congress and read a letter he had received from MacArthur. In the letter, the general openly criticized Truman's refusal to expand the war, famously writing, there is no substitute for victory. It was a direct challenge to the commander-in-chief's authority. MacArthur was trying to dictate foreign policy from the battlefield. Truman read the letter and knew the time had come. He convened his top advisors: Secretary of State Dean Acheson, Secretary of Defense George Marshall, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Omar Bradley. The atmosphere in the room was heavy with history. They all knew the political firestorm that would follow. MacArthur was still a god to millions of Americans. Firing him would be political suicide. But Truman looked at his advisors and said, "Gentlemen, MacArthur has left me no choice. He's publicly defying presidential authority. This is insubordination." Marshall, the man who had tolerated MacArthur for years, finally agreed. "Mr. President," Marshall said, his voice heavy with regret but firm in conviction, "military officers don't get to make foreign policy. MacArthur has crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. You have to fire him." Omar Bradley agreed. The Joint Chiefs were unanimous. The military leadership had finally turned on the man who thought he was bigger than the army. On April 11, 1951, at 1 a.m., a press release was issued from the White House. Truman didn't even wait to tell MacArthur personally. He wanted to ensure the general didn't resign first to save face. The announcement shocked the world. General Douglas MacArthur was relieved of all commands. The reaction was explosive. Truman's approval ratings crashed to 23%, the lowest in history. Republicans in Congress called for his impeachment. MacArthur returned to the U.S. to a ticker-tape parade in New York City attended by millions, a hero's welcome that dwarfed anything Truman ever received. He addressed a joint session of Congress, delivering his famous "Old Soldiers Never Die" speech, bringing tears to the eyes of hardened politicians. But Truman stood his ground. He sat in the White House, weathering the storm, convinced he had done the right thing. In a cabinet meeting, he explained his reasoning with simple, unshakable logic. Roosevelt faced this exact situation. He did nothing because he was afraid of the political cost. That was wrong. It set a precedent that MacArthur could operate outside civilian control. I'm correcting that mistake. Truman understood what Roosevelt had refused to face. The Constitution is not a suggestion. The principle of civilian control of the military is the bedrock of American democracy. If a general, no matter how brilliant or popular, can dictate policy to the elected president, then the republic is lost. MacArthur had spent nearly a decade learning the wrong lessons under Roosevelt that fame equals power. Truman had to unteach those lessons, regardless of the cost to his own popularity. In the end, history vindicated Harry Truman. Senate hearings into the firing revealed the extent of MacArthur's insubordination and the danger of his strategic recommendations to expand the war. The Joint Chiefs testified that MacArthur's plans would have sent the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. Slowly, the public fever broke. MacArthur faded into retirement, his political ambitions fizzling out. The saga of Douglas MacArthur serves as a powerful lesson in leadership and democracy. It highlights the dangerous allure of the great man theory and the vital importance of institutions. MacArthur was a brilliant tactician, a man of immense physical courage and charisma. But he was also a man who believed he was destined to rule, not to serve. Roosevelt, for all his political genius, failed to check that ambition, allowing it to grow until it threatened the government itself. It took Harry Truman, a failed haberdasher from Missouri with a spine of steel, to remind the world that in the United States, the sword always answers to the pen. The firing of MacArthur wasn't just a personnel change. It was the salvation of the American constitutional order.